Do not fear what they fear, but in your hearts, sanctify Christ as Lord. Amen. What is the way of Jesus? Now, most mothers, they know that how to care for children changes over time. In the beginning, parents control everything, how they play, eat, and sleep. And I remember in those years when Heidi was around and we were young parents, everybody called her the Cinderella mom because we would always be in such a hurry to make it home so we could have supper, bath time, read a book, say prayers, and the lights went off every night at the exact same time. Now, over time, of course, we began to offer them a chance to make more decisions for themselves. We went beyond the, do you want to wear the blue dress or the green dress? But that was the process we took. That was our philosophy. I know that some parents ask their children their advice about everything, to decide about everything. But a child really likes to have structure. They like to know where they can stand. They don't want to be in charge of everything. But we gradually loosened the rules, and eventually our kids were in high school and they could make their minds up for themselves. And now, as parents of children in their 20s, our role really is to sit on the bench next to them and to listen to what they have to say. We can no longer fix their problems anymore. They'll always have a place with us at our place, but they ultimately need to be the ones who make the decisions in their life. Over time, our values, even our voices, will become a deep part of them. And long after we have died, they will still have a sense for how we understand the world. About 2 weeks ago, I was talking to a 96-year-old friend of mine, and he told me how sad he was that he didn't have older mentors for himself anymore. And of course, the whole time in my head, I'm thinking, you're my mentor, you know, and I think he thinks there's no older mentors, but the people who are closest to us, their voices still linger. They are still with us as we try to find our way. Now the question, what does it mean to follow Jesus? Now that is not a simple one. It is a controversial question. According to many people, it is an identity, a tribe, a group they belong to, with the corollary that people in other groups are not quite okay until they join their group. And in this view, being a Christian means making oneself believe certain things. But Jesus was not a Christian in this sense. He taught that those who follow him will have what he calls the spirit of truth, that those who love him are the ones who keep his commandment to love. This does not mean loving one's friends alone, but loving everyone without exception. Becoming a full human being means always growing and learning and internalizing this spirit, the spirit of Jesus. 2 weeks ago, I had dinner with some friends and we were studying the Dhammapada, the Buddhist scriptures. And we were particularly studying a line that goes like this: hatred can never put an end to hatred. Love alone can. This is an unalterable law. Now, in response to this, I said that the greatest lie in human history, it's something that's always evolving and changing, and it expresses itself differently in every generation. And it is, quite simply, the falsehood that violence can achieve peace. By the way, this is true of the war we are fighting today in Iran. On February 28th, 156 children, teachers, and others were killed when we bombed a girls' school. This is the natural outcome of violence. More than any time during my life, these days, people around the world seem to believe that having more weapons will make the world safer. And today, I want to talk to you about this and about nonviolence on a social level, an interpersonal level, and on an interior level. We're so lucky to have Ken as our reader. He's like a professional voice actor. And the reading he did, the first letter of Peter, started as a circular letter. So an individual person writes a letter that's going to be shared. And the letter writer was Peter, and he was writing from what he called Babylon, which is code language for Rome. And he was writing to the various churches and communities in Asia Minor. And Peter reminds them that in Christ, all of us have a new family. He answers also a very difficult question. How should a faithful Christian act in these Roman cities where male heads of households venerated Roman gods and had the authority to legally kill their wives and slaves? So that's their situation. So they're looking for guidance. And this is what Peter said. He said, resist evil through love and generosity. In other words, he was saying that the real enemy is not a person, but forces of spiritual evil that lead to hatred and violence. Now, there may be many people who call themselves atheists, but there is a spirit that human beings have. There's a spirit of good and love, and there is a spirit of hatred and enmity. Peter says, though, do not fear what they fear. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands an accounting of the hope that is in you, and do it with gentleness and reverence. Now, in this pulpit, Martin Luther King once stood and preached to 10,000 people. And he inherited this Christian tradition. And he read the classics of Western philosophy and theology. He studied Kant and Hegel and Marx and Feuerbach and Nietzsche and Walter Rauschenbusch and William Temple and Reinhold Niebuhr. But he was most impressed by the writing of Henry David Thoreau and about what he said about the importance of refusing to cooperate in unjust systems. And one of the greatest turning points in Dr. King's life came when he began studying Mahatma Gandhi. King particularly admired his concept of satyagraha. Satya derives from the Sanskrit word for truth, and agraha means holding firmly or insistently. So King writes this, quote, Gandhi was probably the first person to lift the love ethic of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force on a large scale. So with Gandhi, who nonviolently led India to independence, King rejected violence. He described it as impractical and immoral. King understood too, just the way that Peter did, that the enemy is not a person, but a spiritual force of evil that runs through human history. And through our actions and even our thoughts, we either intensify this violence or we diminish it. King writes, quote, to meet hate with retaliatory hate would do nothing but intensify the existence of evil in the universe. Hate begets hate. We must meet the forces of hate with the power of love. Our aim must not be to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding. So nonviolent resistance, it's not something that's passive or it's not something that's weak. Instead, it is an active force in the world, and it means working to change society without resorting to violence or even hatred. King often quoted Booker T. Washington, who said, let no man pull you so low as to make you hate him. I love the section of Martin Luther King's book where he describes listening to the opera as he's driving to Birmingham, Alabama for the first time for his audition and his interview at the church there. The population in Montgomery, Alabama, 70,000 people were white, 50,000 people were black, and through segregation, threat, and violence, black people were constantly being terrorized, belittled, and humiliated. King tells these stories that are so powerful about a white police officer addressing his father as boy, and a shoe store attendant. He and his father went to a shoe store to buy shoes, and the shoe store attendant refused to let them sit on the bench in the shop. King constantly reminded people that the Montgomery Bus Boycott succeeded because of the efforts of tens of thousands of people, and their cooperation and spirit fundamentally altered human history. But this also, it came at a cost, a personal cost that we sometimes forget. Under constant threats to his life, at one point, Dr. King himself faltered. He wondered, after answering a threatening phone call in the middle of the night, whether he was doing the right thing. And so he sat there at the kitchen table at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he sat there and he prayed. And he prayed that God would help him decide what he should do. And then he sat there in silence for a while. And after a bit, he heard this, quote, the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, stand up for righteousness, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever. And after he heard this, his fear just dissipated and his uncertainty went away and he felt ready to face anything. Now that happened one day, right? And 3 days later, Dr. King was at a meeting and 2 of his assistants came to him and talked to him. And they said, we have got to talk to you about something terrible that's happened. And he learned that the bombers had bombed his house. And he didn't know whether his wife and his young daughter were okay. He went back to the house, and when he found them there, he felt such a deep sense of gratitude, so grateful that God had preserved them. But that night, and you may not even know the story, his father-in-law, Coretta Scott's father, came to them to pick Coretta up and the young baby and to take them away. And in a tense moment, Coretta Scott King said to her father, I'm sorry, Dad, but I belong here with Martin. That's what it's like in families when you face such oppression. Martin's own father, when Martin Luther King's father used to talk about the protests, tears would come to his eyes. He was so worried about his son and their family. Now, Martin Luther King, he resisted bitterness. He still believed that all life is interrelated, that we are siblings to each other, that in our struggle for justice, we have a cosmic companion, a personal God who works for universal wholeness. Now, the refinement of this spirit of love, this nonviolent resistance, may be more important historically than the invention of atomic weapons. Who could have imagined when we were young, us old people, that apartheid in South Africa, that the Soviet Union would disappear without bloodshed? All this happened through nonviolent actions. And these methods have been used successfully in Bolivia, the Philippines, South Korea, Chile, Mongolia, Nepal, Mali, Madagascar, Bangladesh, Indonesia. The Christian theologian Walter Wink added up the number of people in societies that experienced successful nonviolent revolutions in the 20th century. And he concluded that it amounted to 3.3 billion people, or 65% of all humanity at that time. And the practice of love, it hasn't stopped. It continues to transform the world. So nonviolence is a commitment to resisting hatred and loving others without exception. It does have important geopolitical implications, but it's also important for how we relate with one another and how we understand ourselves. Marshall Rosenberg wrote about the way these principles can transform our relationships. We can learn to look with the love in our heart at the people who trouble us. We can be taught to communicate directly with empathy, clarity, and honesty. And we can come to learn how not to trigger such defensiveness in other people. I'm only going to give you is a very short outline because I'm very close to the end, but I want to give you a short outline of 4 components of his method. The first is that we speak by making observations without judgment. The second is that we talk about our feelings, how we are responding emotionally. Third, we connect those feelings to underlying human needs, like the need to feel safe or understood. And finally, he teaches us to make requests, not demands, that are clear and doable. Now, I began by talking about how we mature as children, as parents, as Christians, and as human beings. Over time, we can choose violence and retribution, or we can resist bitterness and treat our existence as a school for love. We can choose to believe the ancient lie, or we can realize that there can be no violent means to a peaceful end. These are spiritual questions. Do not fear what they fear. Hatred can never put an end to hatred. Love alone can. This is the way of Jesus.